Dear learners, welcome back to WSE True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Today, we step into the ancient world to meet a boy born not just to rule a kingdom, but to conquer the known world. His name? Alexander. But history remembers him by a far greater title, Alexander the Great. This is not just a tale of war and empire. It's a story of relentless ambition, fierce loyalty, and daring strategy. Of a young prince who studied under the greatest minds, faced impossible odds, and carved a legacy that still echoes across the centuries. His life wasn't just extraordinary, it was transformational. As you listen, you'll not only improve your English vocabulary, grammar, and storytelling comprehension, but more than that, you'll feel the fire of human greatness. You'll understand the cost of ambition, the meaning of sacrifice, the weight of leading men into battle, and the loneliness of standing at the top of the world. Get ready for the most powerful, most motivational story of a leader whose vision outgrew even the horizon. A story that will challenge your mind and stir your heart. Let's start the journey of Alexander the Great, from a young prince to a world conqueror, the story of ambition and strategy. Long before the man became legend, Alexander was born into a world of power, pride, and peril. It was July 356 BCE in the ancient city of Pella, capital of the Macedonian kingdom. Macedon was not yet the great power it would become. At the time, it was seen as a wild and distant land by the refined city-states of southern Greece, Athens, Sparta, Thebes. Yet within its royal palace, a child had just entered the world who would one day surpass all those names. His father, King Philip II, was a master of war and politics. Through relentless ambition and military reforms, Philip transformed Macedon from a vulnerable kingdom into a feared force across Greece. But while the king focused on expanding his rule, he also looked to the future, and saw in his son a spark he could not ignore. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was a woman of fire and mystery. A princess from the ancient land of Epirus, she was deeply spiritual, devoted to the gods, and fiercely ambitious for her son. She whispered to Alexander stories of Achilles, of divine bloodlines, and of destinies written by Olympus itself. In her eyes, her son was not merely a prince, he was a chosen one. From an early age, Alexander was surrounded by power, but also immense pressure. His father was a conqueror. His mother believed he was divine. And the people expected greatness. There was no room for weakness. To prepare the young prince for such a destiny, Philip hired none other than Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the age, to be his tutor. Under the shade of temple courtyards and beneath the open skies, Alexander studied logic, science, poetry, and philosophy. But most of all, he studied how to think. Aristotle opened his eyes to the world beyond war, teaching him the art of reason, the patterns of nature, and the beauty of stories. Still, while books sharpened his mind, Alexander's heart burned for action. Inspired by tales of Homer and the bravery of Achilles, he longed for battles, for glory, for immortality. Even as a boy, his gaze was far beyond Macedon. He wanted the world. But behind this golden upbringing, the court was filled with shadows, jealous generals, rival wives, and whispers of assassination. And although Alexander was the king's son, succession was never certain. In Macedon, power was not inherited. It was seized. Even before his first battle, Alexander had to learn one crucial lesson: in a world of ambition, nothing is guaranteed. Not love. Not loyalty. Not even life. And that lesson would soon be tested. At 13, Alexander was already a prodigy in thought, but what came next would test his spirit. One day, a wild, untamable horse named Bucephalus was brought to the palace. It had thrown every rider who dared mount it. The court laughed as Philip's best men failed. But young Alexander stepped forward. With quiet confidence, he approached the beast, noticed its fear of its own shadow, and gently turned it toward the sun. He calmed the horse, climbed onto its back, and rode it at full gallop. The court fell silent. When he returned, Philip embraced him and whispered, "My son, seek a kingdom worthy of you, for Macedonia is too small." But while that moment earned admiration, it also ignited jealousy. Behind the palace walls, enemies multiplied. Philip had many wives and even more sons. Each had a faction of nobles eager to place their favorite on the throne. Olympias, proud and intense, stood alone against the court's cunning politics. Whispers began to spread. "The boy is half foreign," they said of Alexander. "He's too headstrong. Too ambitious." Things worsened when Philip married a young Macedonian noblewoman, Cleopatra, who gave birth to another potential heir. During the wedding banquet, tensions exploded. One of Philip's generals, intoxicated and reckless, mocked Alexander, calling him a bastard unfit to rule. Alexander stood and shouted back with a boldness that stunned the room. A drunken Philip tried to charge at his son, but tripped and fell. Alexander, humiliated and furious, turned away, saying, "Here is the man who plans to conquer the world, yet cannot even cross the floor." He left the palace with Olympias and disappeared for months. This wasn't just family drama, it was a dangerous signal. In Macedon, an angry king was a deadly threat. Alexander now knew that even his greatest strength, his lineage, was fragile. Being the son of Philip meant glory, but also danger. He could not rely on birth alone. He had to fight for his future. The world outside was just as unstable. Greece was divided. Persia loomed as a distant giant to the east. And Macedon was growing strong enough to make both nervous. Yet Alexander, still a teenager, began to build his own circle of loyal companions. He forged friendships that would last a lifetime, with men like Ascension, Ptolemy, and Cassander. They studied together, trained together, dreamed together. But fate was already moving. Philip's eyes turned eastward. He was preparing for the grandest campaign of his life, the invasion of Persia. He would cross the Hellespont and strike at the heart of the Persian Empire, something the Greeks had only dared during the days of Xerxes and Leonidas. And Alexander? He was left to wonder, would he ride beside his father into glory, or be left behind in the shadows? The court was watching. The rivals were whispering. And then, something happened that changed everything. The year was 336 BCE. Alexander was 20 years old. The palace buzzed with celebration. King Philip had just married off his daughter to the king of Epirus, Alexander's uncle. Leaders from across Greece gathered in Aegae, the ancient capital of Macedon. Philip entered the theater, smiling, proud, basking in his moment of triumph. And then, chaos. A lone assassin broke from the crowd, dagger in hand, and struck Philip through the heart. The mighty king fell where he stood. In an instant, Macedon lost its ruler, and the world shifted. Philip's death sent shockwaves through the kingdom. Panic. Confusion. Blood. Was it a political conspiracy? A jealous lover's revenge? Did Olympias have a hand in it? Historians still debate it to this day. But what mattered then was this: the throne was empty, and dozens of rivals were ready to claim it. Alexander acted without hesitation. Within hours, he rode into the palace, took control of the royal guard, and seized the treasury. His mother, Olympias, moved swiftly, eliminating Cleopatra and her child. It was brutal, ruthless, but necessary, because in Macedon, hesitation was a death sentence. At just 20, Alexander was crowned king. But to the world, he was just a boy with a famous father. The Greek city-states, Athens, Thebes, Sparta, they saw an opportunity. Surely this young ruler could be broken. Surely Macedon would crumble. They were wrong. Alexander marched south with fire in his eyes. He reached Thessaly and found the pass blocked by enemy cavalry. Rather than wait, he led his men through a treacherous mountain path overnight and appeared behind the enemy at dawn. They surrendered without a fight. Then he swept through central Greece, calling a congress at Corinth, where, against all odds, he was elected commander of the Greeks for the coming Persian campaign. Even his father had not achieved that so quickly. And yet, challenges kept coming. The city of Thebes revolted. Alexander gave them one chance to surrender. They refused. What followed shocked the ancient world. With speed and fury, Alexander besieged the city, broke through its walls, and destroyed it. Over 6,000 were killed, and the city was razed. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. It was brutal. Some called it excessive. Others called it genius. The message was clear: this young king was not to be tested. From then on, no other Greek city dared rise against him. He had secured his kingdom. But it had come at a cost. At night, alone in his tent, Alexander did not celebrate. He had loved Thebes. He had studied their poets, admired their warriors. But power demanded sacrifice. And he was no longer a student. He was a king. Now, the path was open. Beyond the Aegean Sea lay the vast Persian Empire, an empire that had once tried to crush Greece, that ruled over Egypt, Babylon, and lands as far as India. Alexander's father had dreamed of conquering it. Alexander would go further. With 40,000 men, he crossed the Hellespont. Before landing, he threw a spear into the sand and declared, "I claim this land by right of conquest." He had left behind the comfort of palaces and the familiar language of home. Before him stretched deserts, mountains, unknown cities, and armies far larger than his own. But he wasn't afraid. In fact, he burned with excitement. He had been raised to believe he was descended from Achilles. Taught by Aristotle to search for meaning. Shaped by ambition and tragedy. And now, standing on enemy shores, he was no longer just a Macedonian king. He was a man chasing immortality. But glory was not given freely. An even greater challenge awaited him. Spring, 334 BCE. The dust of Asia Minor clung to the boots of Alexander's army as they marched inland. The Persian Empire watched with curiosity and contempt. A boy king, thousands of miles from home, dared to challenge the might of the East? At the river Granicus, that curiosity turned into war. The Persian satraps gathered their cavalry on the far side of the river, confident that Alexander would not attack across fast-moving waters. It was a tactical nightmare. But Alexander, true to form, did the unthinkable. He charged. Spear in hand, golden-plumed helmet flashing, Alexander led from the front. Arrows whistled past. Persian blades clashed with Macedonian shields. At one moment, he was nearly struck down. A Persian noble raised a sword to his neck, but Clitus, one of his generals, cut the man down just in time. The Persians broke. Victory. It wasn't just a win, it was a message. The young lion had crossed into their world and drawn blood. Town after town surrendered. Cities opened their gates. Some welcomed him as a liberator from Persian rule. But Darius III, the great king of Persia, could no longer ignore the threat. He began gathering a massive army deep in the heart of his empire. Meanwhile, Alexander pushed further. He reached Gordium, where legend told of the famous Gordian knot, a twisted mass of rope tied to an ancient chariot. It was said that whoever could untie the knot would rule all of Asia. Alexander approached it, studied it, and sliced through it with his sword. Some say it was arrogance. Others call it brilliance. Either way, the prophecy was fulfilled. And the symbolism was clear. Alexander would not be slowed by the traditions of the past. But the real test was still ahead. By late 333 BCE, the two greatest forces of the ancient world stood ready to collide. At Issus, Alexander's 40,000 men faced Darius's army, which was at least twice the size, some say over 100,000 strong. The Persian king sat in a golden chariot, surrounded by elite warriors, family, and servants. He was so confident, he brought his royal household to witness his victory. Alexander, however, had studied the terrain. The narrow coastal plain forced the Persians to fight in a tight space, nullifying their numbers. And then, as dawn broke, he struck. He led the companion cavalry in a furious assault toward the Persian center, cutting through like lightning. Darius panicked. The sight of Alexander racing toward him, eyes burning with purpose, shattered his composure. The king fled the battlefield in shame, abandoning his army, his gold, and even his own family. Alexander captured Darius's mother, wife, and daughters. But instead of harming them, he treated them with deep respect and honor. That moment shocked the world. Here was a warrior who could destroy cities, yet show mercy. Who could conquer nations, but still show humanity. It marked a turning point, not only in the war, but in how Alexander was seen. No longer just a Greek avenger, he was now a man of destiny. Persian cities sent envoys. Local rulers offered alliances. His legend grew with every step. But with fame came new temptations. Alexander began to adopt Persian customs, wearing their robes, using their court rituals. Some of his Macedonian officers were uneasy. Was their king becoming too Persian? Yet Alexander believed in something larger than Macedon or Greece. He dreamed of uniting East and West, not just by force, but through shared culture, language, and respect. Still, the war was far from over. Darius had escaped. He was regrouping. And the road ahead would lead to even greater trials, across deserts, through temples, over mountains. Before Alexander could rule the world, he would have to chase a king to the ends of it. But let's pause for a moment. Do you think Alexander made the right decision by treating Darius's family with kindness instead of vengeance? If it were you, what would you have done in that moment? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because the next chapter in Alexander's journey will shake empires. The Persian king was in retreat, but Alexander wasn't content with chasing shadows. He wanted closure. Finality. Darius III still ruled from deep within the empire, and so long as he lived, so did resistance. Alexander advanced deeper into Persian lands, farther than any Greek general had dared. After conquering Tyre and Gaza, two cities that resisted fiercely, he entered Egypt, where something strange happened. The Egyptians welcomed him. They had suffered under Persian rule for generations. But Alexander, respectful of their gods and traditions, was seen not as a conqueror, but a savior. In a moment that shocked even his closest companions, the Egyptian priests declared him the son of Ammonius, the chief god. Alexander stood in the temple of the oracle at Siwa, where only the pharaohs had gone. No one knows exactly what the oracle whispered to him, but when he emerged, he said nothing, only that he was satisfied. Some say it was then that he truly believed he was divine. But in the distance, Persia still awaited. In 331 BCE, at a vast plain near a town called Gaugamela, Darius assembled what was likely the largest army the ancient world had ever seen. Chariots with scythe wheels. War elephants. Tens of thousands of elite cavalry and archers. It was his last stand. Alexander's generals were nervous. Some urged a night attack. But Alexander refused. He would win in daylight, with the world watching. Before the battle, he lay in his tent, not sleeping, but calm. One general asked why he was resting. Alexander replied, "Darius is already defeated. I am merely waiting for morning to make it official." And when morning came, the battle began. Dust and thunder shook the earth. The Persian chariots charged, but Alexander had prepared his troops, creating open lanes and trapping them. Then, he saw his moment, a gap in the Persian center. With the companion cavalry, he led a wedge formation directly toward Darius's position. It was brutal, furious, controlled chaos. And once again, Darius fled. This time, not just from the battlefield, but into the mountains, never to command again. The war was, for all purposes, over. Alexander entered Babylon in triumph. The gates opened wide. The priests welcomed him. He was hailed not as a conqueror, but as king. Persia, the great empire that once ruled from India to the Aegean, was now his. But at this peak of power, a new conflict began. The enemy was no longer Darius. It was doubt. Alexander began adopting Persian dress, enforcing rituals of prostration, and even integrating Persian nobles into his leadership. Many of his Macedonian generals felt betrayed. They had fought for Greece, not for this merging of East and West. In one chilling moment, the tension exploded. At a drunken banquet, Clitus, the same general who once saved Alexander's life, insulted the king's Persian customs. He reminded Alexander of his father, mocked his new ways, and questioned his divinity. Anger flared. Wine blurred judgment. Alexander grabbed a spear and, without thinking, drove it through Clitus's chest. The room fell silent. Alexander had killed his friend. He was not proud. He was not triumphant. He was broken. He wept for days. Locked himself away. Refused food. For all his victories, all his power, he had lost something more personal, the bond of brotherhood, the anchor of his past. This was his darkest moment. And yet, it was also a turning point. Alexander emerged from that darkness changed. He doubled down on his vision, not of conquering people, but of unifying them. He began arranging marriages between Macedonians and Persians. He declared that all his subjects, regardless of origin, would be equal under his rule. To many, this was madness. To Alexander, it was the future. But such dreams demanded sacrifice. He had chosen a path where few could follow. He had conquered the greatest empire of his time, but the road ahead would take him beyond the known world, into legend. After Gaugamela, there was no force left to stop him. Darius was soon found, betrayed and murdered by one of his own satraps, Bessus, who hoped to declare himself king. When Alexander came upon Darius's lifeless body, he wept. Though they had been enemies, Alexander had respected him as a worthy rival. He ordered Darius to be buried with full royal honors and vowed to hunt down his killer. He kept that promise. Bessus fled east into the remote provinces, but Alexander chased him through mountain passes and across scorching plains. Along the way, he conquered cities, subdued rebellions, and founded new ones, most famously, Alexandria in Egypt, which would grow into one of the greatest centers of knowledge in the ancient world. In every region he entered, he built more than empires, he built legacy. He brought Greek culture, language, and science to the East, while learning local customs, spiritual beliefs, and political wisdom in return. This fusion, called Hellenism, would shape the world for centuries. Still, he was never satisfied. He crossed into Bactria, where the terrain grew harsher and resistance more stubborn. There, he met Roxana, the daughter of a local noble. They married, not just for love, though she was said to be beautiful and spirited, but to unite cultures. She became queen of an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Himalayas. But even the Himalayas could not stop him. With fewer than 50,000 men, Alexander marched into India, a land of elephants, jungles, and kingdoms untouched by Greek arms. At the Battle of the Hydaspes River, he faced King Porus, a ruler commanding war elephants and a massive army. It was one of Alexander's hardest battles. His troops were exhausted. The river was flooding. But with brilliant tactics and relentless drive, he outmaneuvered Porus's forces and captured the king. When Porus was brought before him, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. The Indian king stood tall and said, "Like a king." Alexander smiled. He restored Porus to power and gained a loyal ally. That moment revealed something deeper about Alexander. He did not simply want to dominate the world. He wanted to earn the loyalty of those he conquered, not with fear, but with respect. Still, his men were tired. After years of marching, fighting, building, and bleeding, they reached the edges of the known world. When Alexander suggested they go even further, into the unknown lands beyond the Ganges, they refused. They longed for home. For peace. It was one of the few times Alexander gave in. He turned back. But the journey home was brutal. They crossed the Gadrosian Desert, where heat, thirst, and hunger took more men than battle ever had. Alexander himself nearly died from exhaustion. But they made it. He returned to Babylon, the heart of his empire, with plans for roads, ports, new cities, and cultural exchange. He envisioned an empire of unity, not just through war, but through marriage, law, and shared identity. But time had other plans. In 323 BCE, at just 32 years old, Alexander fell ill. Some say it was fever. Others suspect poisoning. He lingered for days, drifting in and out of consciousness, surrounded by his generals. When asked to whom he would leave his empire, he reportedly whispered, "To the strongest." And just like that, the greatest conqueror the world had ever known, was gone. Alexander's death did not mark the end of his story, it was the beginning of his legacy. In just over a decade, he had reshaped the known world. From the marble temples of Greece to the deserts of Egypt, from the royal courts of Persia to the lush valleys of India, his name echoed in every language. He never lost a battle. Not once. But Alexander's greatest achievement wasn't just military, it was visionary. He believed the world could be more than a patchwork of rival kingdoms. He dreamed of a unified humanity, where East and West could coexist, not as enemies, but as one civilization. He wore Persian robes not to betray Greece, but to honor the cultures he ruled. He married across borders, built cities where different races could live together, and encouraged the mixing of knowledge, art, and language. That idea, though far ahead of its time, planted seeds that would flourish long after his death. The era that followed, known as the Hellenistic Age, saw the fusion of Greek science, philosophy, and politics with the ancient wisdom of the East. Cities like Alexandria in Egypt became centers of learning and innovation, preserving texts and ideas that would later inspire the Renaissance. But not all was ideal. Without a clear heir, his generals, called the Diadochi, divided his empire and fought bitterly for control. The dream of unity fractured into competing kingdoms. Blood was spilled. Cities burned. Even Roxana and Alexander's young son were eventually murdered in the chaos. And yet, despite all that, his dream endured. Every great leader after him, Roman emperors, medieval kings, and modern revolutionaries, studied his life. Napoleon carried the life of Alexander on campaign. Julius Caesar wept when he saw a statue of him, lamenting that he had done so little by the age Alexander had done so much. Why? Because Alexander wasn't just a conqueror. He was a symbol of human potential, unshakable will, and the cost of greatness. He reminds us that to achieve something truly extraordinary, you must be willing to leave behind the ordinary. To take risks. To face loss. To make choices that others won't understand. But perhaps the most profound lesson from Alexander's life is this. Glory fades. Empires fall. But vision lasts forever. Dear learners, we've reached the end of Alexander's incredible journey. But his story lives on, not just in history books, but in the spirit of every person who dares to dream beyond what seems possible. Alexander the Great was not perfect. He made grave mistakes. He hurt people he loved. He sometimes let ambition cloud compassion. But he also showed us what it means to chase a vision so bold, so impossible, that it redefines the world. He started as a student, curious, impatient, determined. He became a warrior, disciplined, fearless, strategic. And in the end, he became a symbol of power, of unity, and of the bittersweet price of greatness. So what can we take from his story? You have the power to overcome limits. To learn from both ancient wisdom and modern challenges. To build bridges, not just walls. And just like Alexander crossed deserts, mountains, and empires, you, too, can cross the barriers of language, fear, and doubt. Every new word you learn, every story you hear, is a step forward. Now, I have a question for you. What lesson do you think can be learned from Alexander's story? And, have you ever experienced a moment when ambition clashed with personal sacrifice? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story inspired you, help us inspire others. Like this video. Subscribe for more powerful English stories. share it with someone who loves history, or who needs a little motivation today. Until next time, keep learning, keep dreaming, and remember, your story is still being written. Goodbye for now.